Hello everyone, welcome to Unit 3. We are going to start Unit 3 off with Biogeochemical Cycles. So the biogeochemical term is going to refer to the living, the earth, and chemical components of these cycles. And they're called cycles because these particular elements cycle throughout the system and are used over and over again. So I wanted to start off with the water cycle. I'm fairly sure that you guys have learned some of the components of the water cycle in previous years. So some of these terms you already know, and then some of them might be new to you. All right. So the number one thing that we need to understand about the water cycle is it is powered by the sun. So we know that water behaves in very specific ways when it heats up, when it cools off, and that is going to be controlled by the sun. Now, water, as we're going to see, is going to move through all of the phases that you guys have learned about before. So it is the movement of water through solid, liquid, and gas. And it does this between what we call sources and sinks. So it moves between sources and sinks. Now the term sinks is a new word for you guys. So a sink, when we're referencing biogeochemical cycles, is something that will absorb that particular item, whether it's water or carbon or nitrogen. It's something that will absorb it. All right, so let's start with some of the easier terms. So we're going to fill in these boxes with the correct phase shift or term that describes what's happening. Okay, so here we have an ocean or a lake. This is probably an ocean. Okay, so an ocean is the primary reservoir for water. We know that the oceans are going to contain the most amount of water. That is pretty easy to remember. So how does water behave from this point? So when water heats up, it becomes a gas, and we call this term evaporation. I'm sorry, my word isn't going to fit in there because you wouldn't be able to read it. But yes, that is evaporation. Okay. Now, when water vapor, in this form right here, cools off, it becomes a liquid again. But when we're talking about the water cycle, it actually will become clouds. So we call this condensation. So clouds are formed by condensation. Now trees play a really important role in the water cycle. You ever notice when you go out in the morning and the grass is wet? That's called dew. And dew is a result of a process called transpiration. So leaves do lose small amounts of water during the transpiration process, and it settles on their leaves, and then that water then evaporates. Okay, so here's more evaporation, and it can eventually become clouds in the form of condensation. All right, now, as I said, when obviously, when you have clouds in the sky, it can produce precipitation. So this is precipitation, whether it is rain or snow or fog, etc. Those are different types of precipitation. All right. Now, when precipitation falls to the earth, it will do one of two things. It will either go into the ground or run off the ground. So if it runs off, guess what that's called? Runoff. And it will make its way back into a river, which will eventually make its way to a lake or an ocean. Okay, now if it goes into the ground, this is called infiltration. Okay, infiltration means it goes into the ground. Now, there's a couple things happening over here. Let's focus on this mountain specifically, okay? So you notice that the closer you get to the top of a mountain, there's less trees, and that's simply because there's less oxygen in the air, and the soil, it becomes more rocky, so it's not going to support life, and it's simply just too cold at the top of mountains. So one thing that we see happen at the top of a mountain is called a rain shadow. A rain shadow, okay? Now a rain shadow happens when you have clouds block one side of the mountain, and one side of the mountain becomes very dry, okay? So rain shadows block half of a mountaintop and produces a dry area, okay? Now, we also see snow up here, so snow, ice caps, those are also reservoirs of water, but they're going to be much smaller. Okay, now, when you have water that goes into the soil, all right, there's another term that we use for this, and this is called percolation. And percolation is going to be the movement through rock and soil. So this is the movement of water through rock and soil. Okay? And that's obviously going to be important for plant uptake, but also this creates what we call aquifers. Aquifers, which is groundwater that we drink from. And the ground actually does a really good job of filtering that water. Okay, now another thing that is important for us to understand is what are the human impacts on this? How do humans impact or change how the water cycle works? So there are two human impacts on the water cycle. All right, the first one is going to be deforestation. So cutting down trees is a major problem. If you're cutting down trees, you're reducing transpiration. You're also going to increase runoff and erosion because trees do a really good job of absorbing a lot of water. And if that is not there, then the water is simply going to run off, which we don't want to have happen. Also, another impact that humans have is climate change. So basically what's happening is we have an increase in evaporation because of increases in the surface temperature of the earth. It causes more evaporation, and water vapor is actually a greenhouse gas. And I know we haven't talked about greenhouse gases yet, but it does increase the ability of the atmosphere to trap more heat, thereby causing climate change to increase. All right, guys, so this is the water cycle. We are going to move on next to the carbon cycle.